Hi, good afternoon. Good afternoon or good morning to all the participants who have made time to join us this afternoon for this webinar, whereby we will be discussing on rebuilding confidence among tourism consumers and businesses in Africa, and also looking at an integrated regional response. Let me start first by introducing myself. I'm Elsia Grandcourt, Director at the Africa Department at UNWTO. I am joined today by my colleague and dear friend, Alicia Gomez, who is our legal counsel, and she will be making a presentation and also co-moderating this session together with me. And also allow me to acknowledge the collaboration that UNWTO Africa Department has with African Union Development Agency, AUDA NEPAD, who is today represented by Madame Estherine Fotabong. She's the Director for Program and Planning at AUDA NEPAD, and she will also join us as a panelist today. And joining her on the panel of experts, I will also introduce those joining us today by starting with Ms. Charlotte Malonda. Charlotte is the managing partner for Charlotte Thomas and Company. And we are also joined by Mr. Salifu Sido, who is the Chief Executive Officer, SME Trade Links. As well, we have with us today Mr. Eric Kaku, who is the co-founder and author of Entrepreneurial Solutions for Prosperity in BOP ESP Partners. And finally, we have Mr. David Gonahasha, who is the Managing Director of Tripsio. So a very big thank you to you all for making time to join us in this exciting discussion this afternoon. And as I mentioned, we will be focusing the discussion with the experts today on the types of regional responses and incentives that could be provided to support the recovery of the tourism sector, especially during this pandemic from a business perspective, but also looking at the key measures to restore confidence among consumers, especially in terms of their rights. But before I pass the floor to my colleague Alicia for her presentation, allow me to recall that during our recent 63rd Regional Commission for Africa, whereby we group all our members as well as ministers of tourism, we took the opportunity also to share the initiatives that has been launched by UNWTO in leading the recovery from this pandemic. And also we recently conducted an online survey to get a sense and a feedback from our members on areas that they would like us to put specific attention to, especially that we have an agenda for Africa that we've been working on with the members on the different themes to help support the tourism sector. And here I would ask my colleague Simon to put in the chat the links that would allow the members to access the survey results, as well as all the documents related to the different initiatives and guidelines that UNWTO has launched in our effort to help member states to recover and also to restart the tourism sector. And the survey, as I mentioned, was to help us gain a better perspective of the current needs and the challenges faced by the African members, especially in the context of this pandemic, whereas you all know travel restrictions, especially coming from the source markets and with the closure of the borders and all the different measures such as social distancing has really impacted heavily on all the businesses, especially leading to important job losses. And in some cases, we've seen also bankruptcy of small and medium enterprises, which all of these, they are the core of our tourism sector. The survey also highlighted a range of actions not just at the political level, but also technical level that is needed to strengthen the collaboration between governments and also to facilitate the creation of investment funds to support tourism and also provide practical support to SMEs. And these actions, as you know, could very much be beneficial to countries that are heavily dependent on tourism and not excluding, obviously, the small island states. So with this, I would invite my colleague, Alicia, for her presentation. But maybe just before, if you look at your screen, we decided to put four specific questions in relation to this thematic this afternoon. Question one, we asking, is it necessary to strengthen the assistance to tourists in emergency situations in Africa? Question two, do you think it would be valuable to harmonize some minimum standards across the region or globally concerning tourism consumer rights protection in the post-COVID era? Question three, in case you have experienced a canceling procedure for tourism and travel related services since the start of the pandemic, how satisfied were you with the results obtained? And the last question, today, how confident are you to proceed to the booking of your upcoming vacation? And here I launch the poll, which I invite you all to take some time during this session to answer. We will try as much to take questions from our audience, which we invite you to put in the chat bar or the Q&A, and we will try to manage this as we open the discussions and try as much to address the concerns that the wider audience listening in today may have. So with this, Alicia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elsia, and thank you for hosting this webinar and also for introducing a new dimension, which is also the one of restoring the confidence of the businesses. I also want to welcome very warmly all our panelists today and thank them for being with us today. We're really privileged to have you, and hearing your views will for sure nurture our internal discussions in the organization, but also personally, I'm sure I will learn a lot today. So I'm truly delighted to have you today in this panel. Now, let me share with you, before I address some questions to the panelists, I would like to share very briefly what UNWTO is doing with regards to restoring confidence. And I think you see now in the screen the presentation. So, of course, most of the measures, most of the recommendations that have been provided by UNWTO to our member states concerned in a first phase the recovery of the industry. But we cannot forget, and we do not want to forget, the perspective of the tourists, how the crisis has affected them, how it has impacted them, and how from UNWTO we may help our member states in recovering the confidence of the tourists. As soon as tourism resumes, international tourism resumes, we are going to be talking about traveling with the virus, at least for some time, with all the risk factors that this entails for tourists, particularly in the event of a second wave or a new outbreak of the virus, which, as we know, remains completely unpredictable, but the pandemic is not over. In this sense, during the crisis, we have all seen how tourists have experienced the following situations. We've seen these all over the news. The closure of borders with little or no notice, leaving tourists with very little margin to react. Millions of tourists were stranded during the crisis abroad, and they suffer different luck and treatment depending on their nationality and the destination where they were stranded. We've seen outbreaks in cruises, in resorts, in hotels, leading sometimes to very dramatic situations. There was big chaos in terms of lack of information as to who is responsible for what. We've seen how some tourists have had limited access to accommodation and public health services in some of the places where they were confined. Millions of flights have been cancelled in the last months, and here we've seen how different measures have been taken from an airline to another, from a country to another. Even here in Europe, within the EU, we've seen very different measures taken by the countries. Some tourists were reimbursed, some others are still waiting for their vouchers or for their reimbursements. And finally, when tourists try to resort to their travel and health insurances, they discovered that these do not cover acts of God, such as this pandemic. In this sense, in the next month, in the next year, and until we have a vaccine or until we have an effective treatment, what we have seen, what the crisis has brought into light, is the absence of an international framework to provide assistance to tourists in emergency situations, and also the lack of uniformity when it comes to consumer rights at the international level. The crisis has also revealed to the tourist his own vulnerability, and also how exposed he is in situations such as the one created by the COVID-19. We believe it's important to restore the confidence of the tourists in the countries of destination, in the sense that these countries will assist them in the event that another emergency occurs, also in their own countries of residence and in the cooperation between the two. But also to have more clarity as to what are the different responsibilities between all tourism stakeholders. And here, perhaps, a new share of responsibility needs to be found, because COVID-19 has changed the rules of the game. So perhaps we need to think about a different distribution of responsibilities that can provide effective guarantees to tourists. So we believe at UNWTO that we may be able to rebuild trust in 2 steps. As a first step, we consider that it's quite urgent and essential to adopt minimum standards on international assistance and protection of tourism consumer rights in emergency situations. So these would cover potential new emergencies, outbreaks, or new waves, so that we don't see the situations that I just related to you earlier in my presentation. And as a second step, we believe it's important to harmonize and develop some minimum international standards when it comes to tourism consumer protection. We are seeing now in the post-COVID-19 scenario, new health, safety, security protocols are being adopted, and these are imposing new obligations on the tourists. Now, these obligations need also to come hand in hand with new rights that assist these tourists and provide them with sufficient guarantees. And all of this framework, the health, the security protocols, but also the rights of the tourists, all of these should be as harmonized, as homogeneous as possible, so that we do not ask or request tourists to have to study the legislation of the countries that they intend to visit, or that they have to hire a lawyer in the future in order to assist them to review the contracts that they intend to sign for a trip, so that they know what they may expect if something goes wrong. Through these 2 steps, we're aiming at developing an international code for the protection of tourists that could provide sufficient guarantees in the post-COVID-19 scenario. Some of the minimum international standards that we think should be included in this code should establish the responsibilities and the obligations for providing up-to-date information during the crisis, basic assistance to tourists during an emergency, also what happens when there are cancellations in case of force majeure situations, what are the responsibilities for cooperation among states, in particular with regards to consular, visa, and repatriation facilities, and also the establishment of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms so that tourists can have their rights restored in a more fast and efficient way, and they do not have to wait for the long, complex judicial mechanisms. At UNWTO, we have been working in the past in the development of these standards. And in fact, a working group of 36 member states and other international organizations, such as the European Commission, ICAO, IATA, was composed in 2012 after the crisis of the Icelandic volcano in Europe. And the purpose of this working group was to clarify the obligations of tourists, service providers, and states during emergencies, to try to find a fair and balanced share of responsibilities among all, to enforce international cooperation, and also it indicated what could be the role of UNWTO to monitor and assist during this type of emergencies. A preliminary proposal for a draft convention was in fact presented and endorsed by the 22nd session of the General Assembly. So what we're doing now in the organization is we've taken back this work that was done, which was quite advanced at the time, and we are adjusting it to the very extraordinary circumstances that the COVID-19 crisis has created, in order to develop some recommendations for our member states for the assistance to tourists in emergency situations. And also we want this work to be used as the basis for the development of this international code for the protection of tourists. So we believe that this code would represent an essential and unavoidable pillar to all the other efforts that are being made in order to recover the tourism industry. So having said this, I thought it was important just to have an overview of what we're doing in the organization, and also to set the framework of the discussion during this webinar. I will now turn to our panelists, who are the true experts here today, and to hear their views. So I will just do some rounds of questions. Of course, we do not expect our panelists to have all the answers. No one has them at this point in time, but we believe that having their opinions will feed very well into the work that we're doing, and will provide us with a lot of ideas to on the way forward. So my first question relates to the assistance to tourists in emergency situations, and to all these situations that I've explained that happened during the worst of the crisis, and how we may rebuild trust after having experienced these situations and knowing that there might be a new outbreak, a second wave. We don't know when, how these will happen. In many countries, we know that the responsibility to assist tourists in emergency situations is not clearly defined. Moreover, in the case of COVID-19, we're not talking about assisting tourists for a couple of days or even for a couple of weeks, but sometimes even perhaps for a month until they are repatriated. So my first question, and I hope the gentleman will let me ask this question first to the ladies. I would like to know, in your views, do you think that the crisis has revealed some loopholes in the legislation when it comes to the assistance to tourists in emergency situations? And how do you think that we could find a more balanced and share responsibilities among all tourism stakeholders? So I will first address this question to Estherine. And
well,
I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Esther, for facilitating this session. And I just want to, before I respond, to also thank UNWTO for the collaboration that we have with UNWTO tourism. We've been doing quite a bit together, and we are very pleased to co-host this webinar with UNWTO, given that this is a very important subject. Now, that said, related to the questions that you just asked, a few African countries, such as I think Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa, have consumer rights policies. However, I would like to give a more security perspective to the question. You know, a pandemic of the magnitude that have just happened we have not had this over a century. Which means, of course, that we don't have any standalone legislation that particularly speaks to such an immense crisis. However, the African Union, informed by the experience in handling Ebola in Lome in 2016, the African Ministers of Tourism in their declaration called on member states to integrate safety and security policies in the tourism regulatory frameworks. The ministers, following that declaration, there was further definition or address of this issue in the African Union tourism strategy. There was a particular section that deals with visitor safety and security in the African Union tourism strategy. I think when we look at, there are two objectives there, but the particularly relevant one is the objective that deals with development of risk and disaster management systems to address safety and security concerns. And there's a particular provision that asks that they should develop victim support services centers for tourists. Now, of course, this is what, so there is some policy at the continental level, but how has this been translated into concrete support, even at the AU level, to member states to design such regulations? I think not much has been done. So there is need for work in this area, because we have just seen over the last 3 years of this pandemic, the number of tourists and business people that have been stranded, and it has not been an easy effort to repatriate these tourists back to their countries of origin. There's no uniform approach. I'm speaking from an African perspective of how tourists who find themselves in this situation will be catered for. So it's a case-by-case basis. Different countries have different approaches, but at least we are pleased to have seen that several African countries did make an effort to organize transportation to ferry back their citizens to their country. So in this instance, it has been the countries of origin that have initiated ways to get their citizens back home, of course, in collaboration with the countries where they found themselves. So I think more can be done in this space. And in that respect, AUDA is currently working with UNWTO and UEMOA to develop a white paper on security, tourism and security. And I think this paper will probably take on some of the issues that are relevant to this question. I would just like to say, though, that the issue of this question is not just limited to the government, but I think all actors have a role to play in ensuring that there's safety and security of the consumers. Maybe I can leave it at this for now.
Thank you very much, Serene. That was very comprehensive. Charlotte, do you share the views that have been expressed? How do you think? I think it was very interesting because Serene just mentioned that perhaps not all the responsibility should fall on the state. So how do you think we could also find a more balanced share of responsibilities of all stakeholders involved?
I think my view will come from a legal perspective, and I'll basically share experiences from the COMESA region, which comprises of 21 countries in Africa, and also the SADC region. So my assessment is that more than 50% of the countries in Africa have got some form of consumer protection policy in place, or some form of consumer protection laws in place. And these are actively being enforced at national level. And the good thing with consumer protection laws is that most of the laws are nationality neutral, which means whether you're a national of that country or you're a tourist, you still get to have that kind of legal protection where you are able to have your rights protected. The other good thing with consumer protection laws is you do not require legal representation in order for you to have access to a remedy. So the processes are simplified, in that a tourist or even a national or a citizen of that country can simply walk into an agency and file a complaint if they feel that their rights have been violated. And sometimes, in some cases, you can also file a complaint remotely through other electronic means. So it means that in terms of the remedies for consumer protection, we have gained some traction in Africa, in that we have some consumer protection policies in place, and we have some form of cover. The challenge, though, that COVID has brought is that most member states have been caught unawares. Much as we know that in Africa, COVID landed a little bit late than in other continents. We did not have specific legislations in place to intervene in terms of protecting the tourists. So most of the legislations that have been put in place, you find that there are restrictions in terms of movement, there's closure of borders, we're having lockdowns, we have curfews, we also have withdrawal of service that are not classified as essential services. And these are most of the services that tourists actually travel to consume. So the loophole that we found in the legislation is that most countries are not providing any solutions for the tourists on what should happen and who has the responsibility to provide any form of remedy. So the tourist is kind of caught in between this situation where it's not predictable and it's not clear. There is no clarity on what kind of remedy they can get and from whom. So some of the problems that the tourists are facing, I'm happy, Alicia, that you've highlighted that people have been failing to go back home. They increased accommodation costs due to the lockdowns. Sometimes they're even seeing forced quarantines, and in this case, forced quarantines, but at the expense of the tourists and not necessarily at the expense of the state. So the biggest challenge in Africa is that COVID-related legislations are more focused on addressing the public health issues and not necessarily the economic activities which may cover tourism. So that is my intervention for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And I think you mentioned also a couple of interesting points also on the forced quarantines and tourists having to sort of bear all the burden of the COVID-19 crisis, even in emergency situations where, in fact, they are the most vulnerable ones and they should be assisted. I will now turn to Salifu Sido, Dr. Sido, and ask you if you also share these views, if you think you have other ideas for better sharing the burden of assisting tourists in emergency situations. Should it be the host state? Should it be the country of origin? Should it be the tourism stakeholder, the insurances, which are reluctant to act in force majeure situations? How do you see it?
Okay, thank you very much, Alicia, and good afternoon to everyone. I would like to thank WTO and NEPAD for inviting us to participate in this particular discussion. Our view essentially is that it should be perhaps a shared responsibility, and we have heard from our legal experts in terms of how this particular situation is handled or is not handled in our African countries. But perhaps just to share a little bit about the South African situation, the practice that has emerged. Essentially, some of the tourists who were stranded when the borders were closed end up staying in hotels. And the good thing that was done by these hotels essentially is that they offered us a discount to alleviate the situation. I mean, they obviously did this out of their own goodwill and also to build trust, because eventually COVID will go away and you will remember that person who helped you during COVID. So it was part and parcel of their strategic, I suppose, marketing to come across as good corporate citizens pitching in to alleviate the situation. The other aspect, as far as the South African situation is concerned, and particularly tourism businesses who thought that they had business interruption insurance, for instance. I mean, that is a huge area that we will need to look into once this particular COVID situation is over. And I think in South Africa, the situation is probably going to go to the courts because insurance companies are definitely not willing to include COVID-related losses as part and parcel of the business interruption claims. So that is something that from a legal perspective and going forward that we'll definitely need to look into to bring clarity in terms of what can be covered, what cannot be covered. Perhaps I should stop there, Alicia, to give other people an opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's interesting, the question of the insurance, and I think that's a global issue. So this is not an African issue or South African issue. This is really a global issue right now. The role that they will have to play in the future, because it's very difficult for tourists to assume that their travel insurance do not cover anything when it comes to these situations. I would like to address the same question. I would like to hear the views of Eric, Mr. Eric Kaku. If you could share with us.
Thanks again for the opportunity to actually participate in this discussion. I think your question was whether or not there were loopholes in the assistance to tourists. I think the answer is absolutely yes. And I agree with what the participants have said before. I think there have been mentions of existing laws. I think what we really have to look at is the fact that the real issue is not whether or not the laws exist. It's whether or not they are going to be implemented. And in a situation of emergency, how long it takes for those laws to actually be implemented. So I think for me, that's really what the challenge has been. I think the crisis has been at such a big level that most countries have actually struggled to really do anything in any amount of time that would be reasonable for somebody who is an emergency. Now, when I think of the loopholes, I have seen loopholes in 3 different areas. I have seen loopholes in who's going to cover the costs, right? This has been discussed quite a bit. You know, if my trip is delayed, if I have to be sort of in a sort of hotel, who's paying for it, right? That's really one loophole. I think a second type of loophole I have seen, which is extremely important, is around safety. We had cases, for example, in West Africa when the crisis started, when people were stuck on planes which were coming from Europe, where there were some suspicions that there were COVID cases on the plane, right? So then they get to the airport, nothing has been organized, everybody's really panicked, right? And then people are being put on a bus, with no masks, no PPE equipment, nothing, right? Literally fending for themselves. In a situation like this, clearly, if there was a clear regulation or a clear, I would say, mechanism or a process, this wouldn't have happened, right? And some people would probably pick up the virus from how those situations are basically handled. So loophole number 2 is really in terms of healthcare and safety. And for me, the third loophole, which we often neglect, but which is critical, is around information, right? Nothing is worse for any family than to know that their loved ones are in the middle of nowhere. I mean, which is how sometimes like tourists view where they are going. And they are not really able to find out what's going on, right? So this lack of information is another big loophole which exists. And it's difficult because you really don't know which website to go to, how to find out what's really happening on the ground, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, those loopholes are there and they are very, very important. But there is something that I would like to stress, because so far we've talked about the role of governments, we've talked about the role of international or organizations. I would like to emphasize one point, which is that actually the first responder in a crisis like this should be some of the businesses which are involved in the tourism activity. So if I am a tour operator and I am welcoming somebody from Madrid, this is actually my guest, right? Now, the question then is, what are we to do when the first responder is wounded? Because what we are not discussing today, which to me is extremely important, is what happened to those businesses which could have been first responders when the pandemic happened. I mean, from the statistics and surveys that we have done at ESP, looking at the number of tourism businesses, basically 9 out of 10 businesses we surveyed actually closed down, right? 8 out of 10 employees in those tourism businesses were laid off, right? If you look at airlines, they are declaring basically $6 billion in losses, which is twice, what was expected a few months ago. In terms of jobs, they are going to reduce the jobs by 3.1 million. I mean, these are huge numbers. So what do you do when the first responder, in this case, the business that is hosting you, is actually wounded? I think it's something that we have to discuss today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think it's very correct. First, I like very much your point on the information, because I think that's the first right as a consumer, information. And even countries or establishments that have some contingency plans, they're not able to communicate them properly, so they're not informing tourists as to what they may expect, and this creates a lot of fear. Also, regarding what you mentioned, what happens when the first responder doesn't respond. Also, in a crisis like this, what we are asking from the first responder might be too much, might be beyond its normal responsibilities, because assisting a tourist for a couple of days, for a couple of weeks, but assisting a tourist for a couple of months, as we've seen in some cases, tourists were stranded for months. As you mentioned, when some of these businesses are falling apart, might also be too much of a burden for the tour operators, agencies, accommodation, hotels, and so on. So finally, the same question I would like to hear, David. I don't know if the participants have covered all of it, or if you still have some ideas on how we could better share these responsibilities in the post-COVID-19 scenario.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be sharing this. I think most of it has been shared in terms of what loopholes have been made, very glaring with the pandemic. Just to reiterate around what Eric mentioned, I think communication is the one loophole that has been a huge gap across many of the markets, and I think it's one of the most important things going forward, especially with the fear around a potential second wave. How do the operators manage communication with their customers? How do they manage communicating with the families back home? And that's something that I think needs to be looked at quite intently.
Thank you. Also going a little bit to the future, to the next year, now that we know what kind of situations we could face if there is another outbreak or a second wave, what do you think? I mean, we've covered some of these here, but what do you think could be put in place? What minimum measures could be put in place so that we give a little bit more confidence to tourists traveling in the next year, that if these situations come back again, there will be something in place? I don't know if this would be, if it's information that is missing, if it's perhaps having a center, as Estherine mentioned, a center for tourists in each country that will take care of them in the case of an emergency, provide them information, but also assist them in the accommodation repatriation facilities. Is it states having to guarantee access to public health services for these tourists coming in case they become sick? What measures do you think should be put in place in the short, medium term?
Great. So first of all, as was mentioned, most states already have some sort of health and safety policies that have been drafted. These need to be implemented, first of all, in terms of one, in the event of a pandemic, how are tourists handled or managed? How is repatriation managed around? Is it handled by the local government? Is it handled by the home country of the tourist? What we saw in Uganda is that after the airports were being closed, we began to see a number of repatriation flights managed by local embassies in the country. So the first step is making sure there's very clear communication around the pandemic to be able to avoid any panic or sense of fear that could happen, to very clear communication around what the SOPs look like at the the tourist locations or the tourist attraction centers. 3, ensuring that there is communication around the communities, because one of the things that we saw is when a foreign person showed up in an upcountry town, there was fear that this person probably has COVID, and what happens in this case. So communicating clearly to the communities as well, and then supporting how these tourists get repatriated back home. So I think there should be, of course, deliberate efforts within tourism regulation structures to manage this process in country.
Thank you very much. Eric, you were mentioning before some issues also regarding information and information to tourists, and also what happens if the first responder does not respond. What measures would you propose for the short, medium term in order to give more confidence to tourists?
Look, I think before we think of the measures, we need to understand the size of the problem, right? So in the context of the continent, when we talk about the measures, I mean, we had basically in 2018, we had 69 million visitors, right? 69 million, right? Of those 69 million, it is estimated that about 70% or 48 million, which is almost 50 million people, were basically leisure tourists. The reason why I am giving you the statistic is because the measures we can put in place if the group we are dealing with is 10 people is very different than the measure we can put in place if we are dealing with 50 million people or 70 million people. So for me, I think that the best measures we could think about would be measures which would equip the maximum number of entities on the continent to respond if there is a problem. I think for us to believe that in every country we are going to have a central or one center who can deal with all those millions of people, I think it's going to be difficult, right? But all those million people, for them to get there, they spoke to a travel agent, right? Or for them to get there, they booked a room in a hotel. Or for them to get there, they are talking to a tour operator. Or for them to get there, they are being invited for a conference, right? So for me, what has to be done is actually making sure that there are measures in place to support those businesses so that they can actually provide the minimum level of services. In the process, keep the jobs that hundreds of millions of Africans rely on to live, and potentially help tourists. And I know UNWTO has done some excellent work on it. I was reading a report that you actually published where you were proposing 3 sets of measures, some of them being direct financial support. You were thinking about loans, guarantees, and helping with corporate bonds, and also tax relief. To me, those measures are absolutely right. And I know that there are certain initiatives by some organizations. For example, ESP has started some work with MasterCard Foundation in Rwanda, where we are currently working to support, a few hundred tourism businesses through grant and technical assistance. I mean, the amount remains small because we're only talking about a couple of $1 million. But to me, this is really the kind of interventions that would be very practical, which can help support the first line of response in our countries so that we can take care of the millions of tourists that we have to support. So that's really one thing that I would say is actually important. Now, Alicia, going back to your question around the information, I think it's very, very important. I cannot stress how critical it is for people to know what they are getting into. So for me, I think information at scale, we know today that through digital means it's possible. So there is really something there that we should do on information, which to me is critical. Thank you.
Much. We were also thinking at UNWTO it would be great to have an app, for example, that would tell you when you arrive in a country, they would explain to you everything, from the health security protocols to be followed to what are also your consumer rights. Sally,
that's a great idea, actually.
That would be fantastic, right? To articulate something like that. And of course that everything is as harmonized as possible so that we don't confuse too much tourists. Salif, what do you think about the measures? What would you propose for the next year to come?
Okay. I was going to basically say that we really need to look at this issue of building trust, tourist trust, on 3 levels. We need to look at it on the international level, what tourism organizations need to do to come up with global guidelines. And when I say tourism organizations, I'm really talking about UNWTO, global organizations dealing with consumer rights, consumer health, and so on and so forth. So at the global level, have directives in terms of how emergency situations should be handled. And then from the global level, we can filter down to the national level, what will be the national policy of a country tourism destination, for instance, when it comes to tourism emergencies. How is it, what is the national strategy for dealing with pandemics, the national strategy for dealing with the emergency emergency situations involving tourists, and so on and so forth. And perhaps the national ministries of tourism would lead the way in that particular area, together with embassies in their countries, just to really make sure that the basics are covered. And then the third level, as I see it, is really at the what our good friend Eric is getting at. Tour operators are basically at the level of the operator. You, the company that brought these tourists in this destination, what is your ultimate responsibility to them? You are a tour operator in Rwanda, in Togo, in Niger, or in South Africa, and you brought in, or 50 tourists came into the destination through your services. What is your ultimate responsibility towards them? And that responsibility obviously should be defined by what the international convention says, together with the national strategy, and then your local level strategy. And in this particular pandemic, for instance, the South African tourism industry is showing the way in terms of how to build trust and get the tourism and put the tourism on a path to recovery, for instance. They have come up with a specific COVID management strategy for tourism operations. And they did not wait for government or for an international organization to do it for the industry. They came together under the umbrella of the Apex Tourism Organization, which is called Tourism Business Council of South Africa. And they use their expertise, their knowledge, their skill to come up with a strategy to manage the situation at their operational levels, and presented that strategy to government for input and for agreement. And I'm happy to report that government has studied the report, and step by step, we are getting the tourism industry to reopen. And the question really going forward is the extent to which we communicate. And I'm glad some of my colleagues have mentioned the importance of communication in this particular situation. How we communicate, how those measures are being implemented, and the success that we are, we are having in terms of implementing those measures. And the successes can be measured by the number of cases that are breaking out or that are not breaking out. And we will need to come up with a tangible way of measuring these matters and using those metrics to communicate how safe our destinations are, how well we're doing in terms of taking care of tourists that we are bringing into the country. So in a nutshell, we really need to have to look at this situation on 3 different levels: the international, national, and the operational level. Thanks, Alicia.
Thank you very much for this. And I think you share our views of trying to do something that is as harmonized as possible at the international level, because you insisted a lot on having a convention or having some guidelines at the international level. And then, of course, each country could implement them in different way, depending on their different, situations, but at least to have some common framework, which is what we from UNWTO, we are trying to achieve, to have an international response, because at the end, the problems are all the same. So now this is the 3rd webinar we're doing on this topic in Africa, but the issues that are coming out, we did this for Europe, we did this for Latin America, and the issues that are coming up, particularly with regards to the assistance to tourists in emergency situations, are the same in the 3 continents. So definitely these are things that we all share and that should be common to all of us. I will now turn to questions that are a little bit more related to consumer protection rights, and in particular to what we've seen with regards to the vouchers versus the refund. We have seen, at least here in Europe, it's been a complete chaos. So I don't know how it's been the situation in Africa. I haven't received that much information there, but we've seen how most of the airlines in particular have provided vouchers instead of refunds. Of course, these measures were very important for the industry to ensure liquidity, but they have created quite a lot of confusion in consumers. So Charlotte, I would like to ask you, what do you think are the legal implications of these type of measures for both for the tourists, but also for the industry?
Well, consumer protection laws are there to protect consumers, particularly from paying for something that they did not use or did not consume. So this means that any conduct which prevents a consumer from getting a refund is in normal circumstances classified as an unfair trade practice or as unconscionable conduct. And these are the kind of provisions that we find are very common in most of the consumer protection laws across the globe and even in Africa, because you find that a consumer is worse off than they were before the transaction. So basically the failure to process refunds will certainly result in mass litigation against companies. And definitely there is need for industries to strike a balance between respecting the rights of the consumer and also protecting the business. The major challenge that we're finding is that most national legislations provide for refunds or exchanges, which is ideal for tourists in this case, especially if it's a COVID-related complaint. A refund is appropriate because at the end of the day, you're not really sure when you're going to be ready to use the voucher. And we're not even certain when COVID is going to be under control or when it's going to end. But the challenge that we're facing is that most of the suppliers would prefer a voucher because most businesses are on the brink of collapse. And they are quite aware that if they provide any full refunds or even partial refunds, they won't be able to survive because of the liquidity issues that you've already highlighted. So in terms of commitment towards consumer rights at continental level, much as we are a long way to go, there are some guarantees in terms of the legal protections that are there for the consumers. But at the end of the day, it's the practicality of enforcing that right that we're finding that it's no longer practical, because you really don't want to be involved in prolonged litigation when you're not in that country. And at the end of the day, you start incurring some expenses because you're trying to push to enforce your rights. But certainly the legal protection is there for the consumer because it's in most cases classified as unconscionable conduct. But we are seeing that most businesses are opting to give vouchers as opposed to giving refunds.
Thank you very much. Also, the vouchers we've seen, at least in Europe, different categories of vouchers. So you have some vouchers that come along with a bank guarantee. You have some vouchers that are for a year. You have some vouchers that are for 2 years. You have some vouchers that are reimbursable at the end of the year if you don't use them, but others are not. So all sorts of different approaches. David, how do you see this situation? What implications do you see both for the tourists and also for the industry, and how this may breach also the trust relationship between the two? I think we have to unmute.
Yeah. Flexibility across both operators and airlines with willingness to give refunds. And this is because, you know, tourism in this market really is a buyer's market, and they have they're very willing to process cash refunds in some cases. About 85% of the trips in this market have been cancelled or been rescheduled. What we also saw was that there's a lot of engagement between the operators and the tourists. One of the good things for the local operators is that because the wave came a little bit later to the African continent, they had time to actually negotiate with many of their customers and be able to negotiate more favorable terms around how they deal with it. Most customers, at least with some of the agents that we've engaged with, they're starting to actually see customers returning to make bookings, which for 2021, which shows a rise in confidence around them possibly traveling eventually. So from an impact perspective, what we're seeing is there has been a resumption of confidence, and people are actually willing to make bookings longer term. There's not been very much refusal hindrance to the voucher or the refund process in this market. I think it also helps that most of the agents don't deal with very big numbers of tourists individually, and that does help quite a bit.
Thank you very much. Here in Europe, as I said, it's been a big chaos, and countries have taken very different approaches. And even within the European Union, where there are some directives that protect consumers, and we've seen that the EU has not accepted to derogate from these directives, even in the case of COVID-19, and it has issued a very strong commitment towards tourism consumer rights. So my question, Estherine, is: do you think it would be possible to somehow harmonize the consumer protection standards in Africa? Do you think it's feasible with those that exist in Europe, which are quite stringent on the industry, let's say? Or is it perhaps we need to get in touch with the European Union and see how to provide some more flexibility? Do you think it would be possible to harmonize the consumer rights protection among the two regions?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and the issues of harmonization are always easier said than done. But if I think it should be encouraged, though. I mean, we live in a globalized world whereby, you know, what happens in Europe do have an impact in Africa. So it will be interesting, I think, to encourage, you know, either airlines or travel agents or hotel chains to use similar approaches. I think, you know, if a hotel, if I take, and I'm just using Radisson Blu as an example, that has hotels across the continent and in Europe, one will expect that, you know, they will have similar cancellation and refund policies worldwide. So you don't want different policies to apply in different regions. So if that harmonization can be done, I think it's something to encourage. And I mean, going to just the previous questions you asked in terms of issues of vouchers and refunds. While most consumers will prefer to be refunded, I think one needs to also look at the questions of vouchers and how to make them more flexible for the consumers. So I think some of the colleagues have alluded to a point where it don't have to be so rigid. They can introduce other elements that builds in flexibility in the use of vouchers. So if it's something, or if the lifespan of that voucher is a year, they can build in elements to say it can be renewed, or you can transfer it to another party or to a family member, make it more user-friendly, if you like, for consumers to use them. So going back to the point on harmonization, I think it will be useful. It will be useful to have a conversation, for instance, at the level of the African Union, with the European Union, on how this issue of harmonizing policies can be looked at, and work with different bodies as well, like the International Air Transport Association or the ICAO, and see what aspects, because I think there are some aspects that can be harmonized, and there will be others that might not be easily harmonized. So at least have a conversation and an engagement on which are the areas that we can have similar approaches to tackling the questions or the issues of consumer safety and security and confidence.
Thank you very much. Charlotte, with your experience also working in other intergovernmental groups on consumer protection rights, and with your knowledge of African legislation in this regard, do you think it would be feasible to try to harmonize with the EU, or to have a discussion with the EU and try to set a common framework, some common ground in the post-COVID-19 scenario, taking into account that COVID-19 has changed the rules of the game, and that perhaps the EU directives also need to be reviewed and adjusted to the new situation?
Yes, I think definitely at a global level, the possibility of harmonizing is there, but what we just need to do is to start the process. And much as the commitment towards consumer rights at continental level has taken some, we've moved forward. Much as we do not have a continental standard body for consumer rights, we also have African consumer bodies being members of ISPN, which is the International Consumer Protection Enforcement Network, but it's more in terms of cooperation or not necessarily enforcement. However, we do envisage that at the African continental level, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is seeking to integrate markets of member countries to facilitate trade, investment, and ultimately economic development. And the agreement establishing the AFCTA was signed in 2018. And at phase 2 negotiations level, which we're supposed to commence those negotiations, but they've been slowed down because of COVID. But there is, within those negotiations, there is a competition protocol which was set up, and within the competition protocol, there is an element of consumer protection, which is dedicated to protecting consumers at continental level. And at the end of the day, it will feed into the global consumer protection principles. So I believe that the adoption of a uniform continental regime, particularly through the African Union, can definitely ease off some of the difficulties that are likely to be faced when we are trying to harmonize all these multiple consumer protection regimes which we have at national level. There also, the other complication that we have is there is an overlap in terms of membership of economic blocs, in terms of the RECs. We have the African regional blocs, which are particularly comprising of SADC, COMESA, and EAC. But such kind of overlaps in terms of membership are going to be dealt with when we look at the kind of framework that we're going to come up with at continental level. There is need for us to come up with some form of correlation between the continental rules and also the global rules. But at the end of the day, we are going to have a minimum standard or model consumer protection rules, which are going to trickle down into the national rules. So harmonizing is possible, but we need to make sure that African policymakers ensure that they create an enabling environment for tourism to thrive, especially by providing the minimum legal guarantees, especially in the consumer protection pieces of legislation. So I think harmonizing is possible, but we need to, first of all, try to see harmonizing happening at continental level, and then it will feed into the global harmonizing agenda.
Thank you very much. Also, I think this relates with the, all the new safety and security measures that are being taken. So you mentioned it, the forced quarantines, who pays for forced quarantine, or what happens if you're denied boarding because you have a higher temperature, and so who will pay for that? And so in all these new situations that didn't happen before and that now we're seeing with the COVID-19, and where we're also trying to have, at least from UNWTO, we are promoting having safety and security protocols that are harmonized. Shouldn't it be quite straightforward? Of course, I speak as an international lawyer, that all of these consumer rights are also harmonized to facilitate international travel, so that a tourist knows exactly what to expect from a country to another. I'm asking you, Charlotte, do you think that policymakers now, because they're going to be facing these questions, which are not specifically regulated in the legislations, but have arisen after the crisis, do you think there would be also a will to potentially harmonize across the region?
Yes, definitely the political will is there, because first of all, we were seeing that tourists were finding themselves in emergencies. You spoke about the volcanic ash, which the incident that happened a couple of years ago. We've seen tsunamis, we've seen incidences of Ebolas, and now we're seeing that we have coronavirus on our hands. And we're seeing that the political will is there, because we're finding a lot of our own nationals stranded in other countries, and they don't have any legal remedies at their disposal. They do not have any access to public health facilities. So the political will is definitely there for us to have some form of model guidelines, which will be used. They must be fair, they must be reasonable, and at the end of the day, they must be uniform across the globe. So the political will is definitely there, because we've seen the effects of COVID-19 and how the tourism sector is actually on the brink of collapse, because there's no confidence anymore on the legal securities, if any, that are there.
Thank you, Charlotte. Eric, do you are you also positive that there might be an opportunity now, because of the COVID-19, to set a framework, not only safety and security, but also on consumer rights that is harmonized across the region, so that it makes sense, at least within Africa, to have something common?
Yes, I actually believe that there is an opportunity. So, and I really appreciate what has been done, what has been said by my sort of the other members of the panel. I think the real issue is around implementation. So if I go ahead, I don't think we are going to have a lot of people refusing to have an harmonized framework. I think the challenge is going to be whether or not we are actually able to implement it, right? And I think as it relates to the implementation, there are probably a couple of reactions or elements that I would like to provide, right? Number one, when we think about, for example, payments, payments as it relates to tourism in Africa, actually, from the statistics that I found, about 62% of the payments which are made are going to be made at the hotel, right? This is actually something that matters because if we are looking at Europe or the US, etc., a number of the payments actually happen before the experience happens, right? In this case, we are dealing with payments which haven't been made. No, that's the first point. Second point, if you look at some of the stakeholders who get payments ahead of time, it's because they themselves have to pay somebody else ahead of time. Let me explain. If I am a tour operator and I have to book, let's say like a gorilla permit, right? I have to pay the park when I am making the reservation, which is the reason why I am asking the tourist to pay ahead of time. So when the tourist then comes to me and say, reimburse me, I have to go back and make sure that I can get the park to reimburse me, which is not that easy, right? So for me, I'm really saying all of this to say that, yes, there is going to be political will. Yes, we are going to be able to put together a framework that everybody agrees on. But then when it comes to implementation, my belief is that the devil is going to be in the details, and we may find that it's not so easy to implement.
Thank you. And you pointed out very rightly at the complexity of the tourism chain, which makes it even more difficult for the tour operators to have a consistent policy if perhaps the other service providers are not being consistent in their approach or are in another country where they have a different approach. So this is also why from our perspective, everything should be harmonized so that we avoid having also market disparities.
I think, Alicia, as you mentioned this, I am tempted to give you another statistic, which is what is the amount of money that the average business on the continent has on hand, right? You are looking in the kind of, Africa, your basic SME, maybe 20 days, right? Because look, they don't have working capital finance, they don't have access to credit cards if they are a sole entrepreneur to be able to use that to fund their businesses. I mean, we are dealing with operators who have very, very limited, because I really want to put this on the table, because if it's the same rule across the globe, I am not convinced it's going to be appropriate for Africa, because some of the other mechanisms, I mean, I started my own business in the US, right? Some of the other mechanisms that I had to finance my business personally in the US don't exist in Africa. So if you have exactly the same rule, it may look on the surface like it's level playing field, but in practice, it may not work. So I think we need to look at those issues in detail, because otherwise the implementation we may find is very, very difficult.
Thank you. That's very interesting. David, what are your views on this? Do you agree with Eric that in the practice, we might find the difficulty in harmonizing? I think you have to unmute the micro.
Yeah, I think that's implementation is generally the biggest challenge across most of our African countries. I, however, think we should start looking at harmonization from the regional level, okay? Because today, between Uganda, Rwanda, and Kenya, there's the single tourist visa that has been running for some time. And without harmonization of these policies, what then happens to tourist expectations going between countries? So I think the regional blocks give a very good possibility to test out what it would look like to harmonize, and then eventually start to scale that up.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have to say that it's interesting because, yes.
Alicia, can I add?
Yes, please.
I just wanted to, I mean, this is really a fascinating debate, and we're getting a lot of input from panel members. I just wanted to add that while the situation as it is very complex and we don't really know how it is going to get resolved, just thinking from a tourism development or destination management point of view, post-COVID, those destinations that would be very successful in attracting tourists from source markets, irrespective of what that source market would be those markets that actually have been able to figure out how to manage these situations and use it as a marketing factor to make themselves, to have a competitive edge on destinations that have not attended to these situations. So as we gear to prepare ourselves for a post-COVID Africa, we are going to really market this continent and try and get our fair share of the tourism cake. It will be imperative for our policymakers to really look into this and harmonize to the maximum possible. Obviously, there will be some differences here and there, but to the maximum possible for us to be able to confidently sell our continent as a tourism destination of choice in those source markets that we'll be targeting. Thank you.
Alicia, if I can maybe react quickly to what Salifou just shared. There was an announcement that came from the EU at the beginning of the week that has been making all the social networks, where out of the 16 or so countries that are being allowed to fly nationals to the EU, there are basically only 4 African countries, right? 3 of them are from the Maghreb. I think it's Algeria, Tunisia, and I think like Morocco. I think there is a reason for that because they have a number of citizens that go back and forth. And then there is Rwanda, right? So the point that Salifou is making in terms of the importance of showing how well we manage the situation on the completeness of the destination is absolutely correct. All the other countries are saying, but why not us? I mean, but it's really this issue of, well, you know, how are you managing the pandemic? And also, how is your management of the pandemic being perceived by the rest of the world, right? So I really wanted to stress how important the point that he has just made is. Thank you, Salifou.
Yeah, I fully agree actually with those views too. I think that how we make sure that we have a confident destination will and how we ensure to tourists that we will take care of them if something happens, that we will provide them sufficient guarantees. I think those are going to be the competitive advantages in the future that are gonna make a tourist decide between a destination or another. Even just having more information on a destination than on another regarding to consumer rights, assistance in emergency situations, even only that could perhaps make you choose between a destination or another. So in that sense, you know, for example, Europe has this reputation, right, of having very high consumer rights standards. So you would think that Europeans will now tend more to, you know, travel within the region. But if we can somehow harmonize this and also for the EU perhaps to find some room for flexibility so that all of us have the same or similar standards, then I think that tourists will not focus so much on these to choose from a destination to another, which was the situation before COVID-19. I don't think that before COVID-19, anyone looked at the little, at the little articles at the end of the contract to see what can happen if a problem arises. So these are new, let's say, new behaviors that the consumer is going to have after the post-COVID-19. And I think we need to address them appropriately and in a harmonized way. So I don't know if at this point, when we've discussed all the consumer protection rights issues, I think it would be interesting if Elsia could give us the results of the poll so that we know if the audience thinks as we do or if we are in a completely different phase?
Yes, thank you, Alicia. Very interesting discussions, and it's clearly reflected in the results. So, Tijana, if you can help me here to share the results on question 1. Can everybody see the screen? Alicia, can you see the screen? Okay, there you have your answer. If it's necessary to strengthen the assistance to tourists in emergency situation in Africa, it's a definite yes, for sure. If we move to question 2. Do you see question 2? Do you think it would be valuable to harmonize some minimum standards across the region or globally concerning tourism consumer rights protection in post-COVID era? Again, straightforward yes on this one. Next one. And if we think it's valuable to harmonize, no, sorry. In case you have experienced a cancellation procedure for a tourism-related service, how satisfied were you? We can clearly see that there was not much satisfaction as well. And the last result, how confident are you? So there's still a lot of work to be done to build the confidence. I think the earlier discussion talked a lot about the importance of trust and rebuilding confidence for our consumers to be able to travel and experience again. So there you are. These are the results of the poll, which I believe also reflect the line of discussion that we've been having this afternoon. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's good to see that the audience has also the same views, because this is coming from our member states. So it shows that there is now some will to discuss and consider these issues. So of course, it's not, it's not the ideal situation, but it highlights that these are things we need to be working on to support our member states' efforts.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Alisa, do you want me to move to the second part?
Yes, please.
Okay. I think in the same line as we are talking about rebuilding business confidence, especially, and tourism-related activities, especially we see that with this virus, it has affected markets all throughout, including us here on the continent, as the discussion have shown earlier. And this is leading really to a drastic decline in demand of goods and services as well in the tourism sector. And most African countries, if we look at it, we have not necessarily prioritized major SMEs guarantee programs or supporting financial schemes, for example, for the tourism sector. And if they did, or they do, government intervention might have limited direct benefit for the small businesses, since, as we know, majority of these SMEs, they are within the informal sector. So maybe to address this concern to all the panelists, as you look at the private sector during both this rebuilding and recovery phase of the tourism sector, what role do you think the private sector should play? I think a couple of you have already touched on that point, but if you could reiterate it, and what feasible and practical measures do you think could be set up at the regional level with businesses in order to access the liquidity support, also whilst they're establishing the new health protocols in order to be able to travel safely and to help diversify the market? I know, Eric, you touched a little bit on this in one of the questions earlier. Would you like to go ahead on this response?
Yes. Look, I really think that the private sector really has to be one of the first line of response, as I was saying earlier. To me, it's really that they have to be the first responders for the simple reason that very often they are going to be the interface between the destination and the tourists. So if we think about the experience of a visitor, very often from the airline to the travel agent to the tour operators to basically everywhere they go, they are likely to touch a business, right? So anything we can do to make those businesses stronger, I believe is going to help in relaunching our countries as it comes to tourism. So to me, what's really important is to make sure that, number one, some of the funds that have been identified are made available. The truth of the matter is that, I mean, I look at the 10 countries or so we've actually been engaging with since COVID started. We have seen that a number of things have been announced in the media, but those businesses, whether they are large, medium, or small, haven't seen the resources yet, right? This is actually important because, as I was saying earlier, we are looking at 20 days of cash on hand, and the crisis has been going on for 3-4 months. Obviously, if it takes 5 or 6 months before the businesses get whatever emergency help they were supposed to get, they will be dead, right? So clearly, there has to be a mechanism where we again speed up the implementation of what has already been decided. And what is really important to note here is that it's not because there isn't a willingness to provide the resources, but the mechanisms to implement help on such a large number of SMEs or such a large number of businesses is in many, many countries a problem. And the people who are managing the mechanisms are not equipped to do it at scale. That's point number one. Point number two, it is going to be very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all approach. If I am an airline, I was mentioning earlier that airlines for 2020 are saying that they are going to have $6 billion in losses, right? Airlines are completely different animals than hotels, who are a completely different animals than tour operators, who are completely different than everybody else. But what is even more important is all those tourism and hospitality businesses are different from agribusinesses, ICT businesses, etc. So to me, the second level is going to be the need to have programs which are specific for tourism, right? This is the reason why some of the research that UNWTO has done is so important, because in some of the interventions that you have identified, you identified interventions which were based on what tourism businesses say they need. And my view is that there needs to be general windows as the ones we have had so far for the emergency phase, but in the second, third, and fourth, and fifth phase of this sort of COVID response, we need to have sector-specific responses. That's number two. And to me, the third element, which is going to be very, very important, is also to keep the businesses accountable. So I'm not here to advocate for a scenario where, public resources. I mean, I believe I saw, I think, a report published which mentioned that there was about $89 billion with a B, which had been mobilized by about 30 development partners just for the private sector in Africa. This is a lot of money, right? But this is also taxpayers' money from those donor countries, right? I am not advocating for a buffet style, approach. I believe that we have to hold the businesses accountable. What do I mean by that? Should we help those businesses who are going to commit to protecting jobs? In some of the programs that we are implementing right now, post-COVID, with people like MasterCard Foundation, US Africa Development Foundation, etc., all those kind of players, we are making whether or not the businesses are going to protect jobs a condition to receive the help, which is only fair, number one. Number two, we also need to see that the businesses that are being helped are also looking to upgrade themselves. What I mean by that is we shouldn't be in a position where if there is a second wave, the first people that we help are right back where they were when the first wave started. So I'm going to stop here, but I really believe that there needs to be a number of measures which are specific as it relates to the private sector in general, but also to tourism in particular. But we have to hold the businesses that are being held accountable.
Thank you, Eric. Yes, I think very pertinent, because there is the sense of urgency, making the funds available, as you say, to reach these businesses, but also to be held accountable. Totally true. Madam Fotabong, can you enlighten us on this point from your end as at NEPAD? How do you see this, especially the role of the private sector during this rebuilding and recovery phase? And maybe to support. Can you hear?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think that's a very important question, and I just want to build on some of the points that the last speaker, Eric, made. I have to say, well, the COVID-19, and I think we do have to appreciate the efforts that many African countries have taken, not only to contain the spread of the virus, but also to respond quite quickly in an effort to save jobs. And in that respect, measures have been taken to support the private sector, in particularly the SMEs that are operating in the space. So we have seen across the continent, countries like South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, and a few others have injected stimulus packages to the tourism sector in their respective countries, and particularly to SMEs in the tourism industry, to help them stay afloat while they go through this pandemic. The tourism recovery could also be boosted also by including tax holidays, so lowering taxes for investors in the sector. I think that's something that can be done. Countries can look into this and see what is possible in their physical space to encourage investments by the private sector. Of course, however, we have seen that there has been some challenges with these packages that countries have put at the disposal of the private sector. I was listening to the news this morning, and there was a big issue of accessing these resources. And there were a number of reasons. One, the technology, the infrastructure to receive all these applications and to process them on time for these businesses to receive funds is a huge challenge. So that is first of all, from two sides on the infrastructure conversation. Actually having the appropriate infrastructure to be able to have access, for the companies to have access is a challenge. But even when the infrastructure is there, the applicants are having challenges using it and filing an application to get those resources. So that's a big problem. Secondly, there's the issue of the capacity to manage this huge influx of applications at the level of the relevant government agencies that have the responsibility to disburse these resources, but also the companies to complete the forms that they have to send. So there are big issues of really capacity building that needs to be done from the lessons that we have learned from this pandemic, as well as the infrastructure that is needed to have these innovative ways of doing business and to be able to reach out to the private sector. At the AUD level, we are conducting a study to identify global best practices and evidence-driven strategies to support AU member states recover both in the medium to the long term. This one, when we get the report of the study, we will have a workshop to validate it, and we will bring group of experts to participate in the validation of this report. And let me use this opportunity to extend an invitation to everyone participating in this meeting right now to work with us, review this document and validate it, because it's really important. We have seen actions at the country level. Now, what can be done at the regional level or the continental level? Hopefully, this study will help to show us what is being done in other regions, and we can interrogate them and see how to either adapt them to the continent or just learn lessons that we can use and reflect on and see what kinds of strategies we can then put at the continent, at the African level, but at the continental level, as well as the national level, to be able to ensure that the private sector in this space actually not only survive but get back on the course and create the job opportunities that this sector has been identified as a critical sector to contribute to under Agenda 2063 of the African Union. Thank you. Maybe I can leave it at this for now.
Yeah, I just, I think NEPAD also has an initiative in supporting the SMEs in partnership with EcoBank, isn't it? Do you want to share a little bit with us on this?
Right. We have the 1,000 SMEs initiative, and really this is working with EcoBank and with others to see how we can support African SMEs with credits to be able to roll up their business. It's it's still in development. Looking at the fine details, which is the point I was making earlier, on how to reach out to these SMEs, or how these SMEs will have access to the resources that have been guaranteed by EcoBank and other actors that we are putting together. So it will be, I think, a major boost to the African SMEs once we get into implementation of it. We also has established a platform for private sector. So 3 weeks ago, we had a webinar with the African private sector engaged in the tourism industry. And basically to hear from them what were the issues that they have faced during this period of the pandemic, and what will be the suggestions of the kinds of support that they will like to see from the member states and from AUD and other partners as a whole. So that report also is being finalized, and we will share it. We will have it on our website for people to explore. We intend to keep that platform and have it as a space where we can have engagement with the private sector, particularly SMEs in the tourism industry, to just get share experiences, get feedback on policy issues and capacity related issues that they would like support on.
Okay, thank you. Charlotte, you want to add something?
Yes, I just wanted to add on what Estherine has said. Really, rebuilding the business confidence is a collective responsibility. So we have the responsibility of the state, and we also have the responsibility of the private sector. And I think, like what Eric said earlier, government needs to provide the bailouts for the tourism industry, bailout packages to support SMEs and MSMEs in order for them to get back on their feet. But on the other hand, the private sector also has a responsibility to be compliant with consumer protection regulations or rules. And Estherine has talked about capacity building. It's something that can be done if we're going to use international best practices. So coming up with things like compliance program and basically training the businesses on how to be compliant with consumer protection rules, particularly the rights of the tourists during emergencies. So this is something that will rejuvenate the industry because it's a two-way relationship. So it's a two-way relationship and it's a collective responsibility. And we're all learning from this virus. I mean, no one is really an expert. Even consumers are learning, businesses are learning, and it's a journey that we have to be prepared to take it together. That's all I can say for now.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for your contribution. And also I want to add here that even from our side at UNWTO, through our dashboard, if I will ask Simon also to put the link, is where you can gather, we've been gathering information from member states on what are the fiscal measures that have been put in place, the monetary policies, etc., in order to help countries in this specific instance. And as you say, it's new for everybody. We also have the private sector also sharing what is being done. So this is another aspect of our work that we're focusing on. So Salifu, can you add something on this point, especially that you are dealing a lot with the SMEs as well?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Elsia. I think in terms of mobilizing resources and to address COVID and its impact on businesses, particularly to small businesses, a lot has been done. Governments as well as private sector have made available pots of money, if I should use that expression. I mean, if you look at the South African situation, we have all sorts of funds or assistance funds that want to do this or that for businesses under COVID-19. But the situation, the reality of the situation is that it's not really always easy for businesses to access those funds. They are there, but the bureaucracy that you will need to go through to be able to access those funds are really just unbearable to some of the businesses because of the capacity issue that panelists have already mentioned. So starting, basically, what I was going to say is this, measures that could be set up at regional level to support access to liquidity. That's how I wanted to address this situation. Starting at the national level, we need to have better coordination and alignment at national level of all these schemes that have already been made available in terms of proper governance. We don't want some of the issues that are so common in business to start creeping into these funds that have also been established. We need to clarify and make it easier for businesses to access those funds. We need to reduce red tape and bureaucratic processes to avoid unnecessary delays in disbursements. Because without those funds, some of these businesses are going to go down under. And I'm not talking about Australia here. For instance, the TBCSA has done a survey recently, and they indicated that without proper assistance, about 49,000 businesses could be forced to close down. And we are now talking tourism businesses, in tourism SMEs, particularly in South Africa. So the situation is real. The funds are there. We must make it easier for businesses to access those funds. It's a matter of survival. That's at the national level. Now, At the sub-regional level, what can be done? And I was listening carefully to some of the input from Eric as well from Estherine. At the regional level, I think we need to give consideration to setting up regional funds alongside the regional economic communities. Can we, if we were to take SADC, for instance, is it possible to set up a tourism support fund that will look after tourism businesses in the SADC region? And we can multiply this at the ECOWAS level, at the EAC level, at the COMESA level, and you name it. We need to really focus access to finance at that particular level and come up with the mechanisms that will make it possible. At the continental level, and I know that there's a lot of discussion going on about AU setting up its own tourism structures and so on and so forth. And Elsia, as you know, it has been one of my really dear ideas to have a continental level tourism support fund. However, that is capitalized. I think if you were to look at organizations like the African Development Bank, they have enough capacity, expertise, and know-how in terms of setting up such a fund. At the international institutions such as the World Bank's IDA, for instance, the International Development Association, they have raised recently lots of money. In fact, they've raised, if I'm not mistaken, $82 billion US, of which 53 is earmarked for Africa to be spent during the years 21 through to 23. Can our policymakers get into these kind of negotiations with these kind of international associations, international organizations, to make sure that some of these monies are reserved to, are earmarked for tourism development in the continent, and programs are developed at the regional level, at the national level, to tap into these resources to support tourism. Because if you were to look at every single African country, there isn't a single country that says, that does not mention tourism as one of the areas for socioeconomic development. If we are putting these in our policy statements, then perhaps COVID gives us the opportunity to really sit down collectively at the continental level, at the regional level, to say, okay, now let's really get serious about this thing. How can we now be serious about setting up these institutions to promote and support tourism, particularly tourism small businesses? Large businesses will take care of themselves. That's not even the issue as far as I'm concerned. But the small guys, because remember, they are the ones with the capacity for job creation. So it's something that I'm putting out there. I mean, we have NEPAD on the panel, we have UNWTO on the panel, and we have operators. And if we can really start giving this idea of regional and national funds to support tourism development in Africa, I think we'll get somewhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Salifu. I think you hit it on the nail, and definitely we will pursue this discussion with the different partners, especially financial partners that we work with. Of course, you know that the role of UNWTO is really to work with member states in mainstreaming tourism in their national agenda. But as you said, it's not just to have it in the policy structure, but you need to have the political will. And I think with this situation of COVID, a lot of countries, those that were heavily dependent of tourism, obviously felt the brunt at the very beginning, but it's trickling through to the other member states also that have tourism as one of the main contributor to the economic sector. So can we ask David, do you share similar views, especially also that you are a young entrepreneur in this field?
Yes, so with regards the bailouts, I think these are very important for most of the operators or most of the industry. However, I'd like to share another side of this, because you do realize that as this money comes in, it will give these many cases these companies a couple of months of working capital ability to stay open and alive. What happens when the second wave comes? Do we do another bailout bit? Because these companies are heavily reliant on Western tourists, so people from Europe and America. What happens in Uganda, for example, where in February next year we have an election, which means for the Ugandan tour operators, it's not only this period that is closed, but even the start of 2021 will not really be happening because of the political activity. I think it is very important to look at other strategies to also support these tourism businesses. One, I think there should be a deliberate effort to help them diversify and refocus on the domestic markets. Because for you to be more sustainable and less vulnerable to such external shocks, you would need to have a domestic market that's not going to be heavily impacted with things like travel advisory or some other epidemics that do happen. And that calls for being able to support reprioritization. We realize that many agents today are trying to rethink to target the domestic market because it's the only available market. Unfortunately, pricing is still in USD. Pricing is still extremely limiting, and they need to think about how do they grow this. The other thing is ensuring that these organizations start to implement digital tools to help them, do things like payments processing, because that way they have data they can track to be able to get access to credit. Many small operators that we work with, because this is what we do, many small operators that we work with do not have any information on their business. They run very short Excel spreadsheets that they keep for a few months. They have no idea where their customers come from. They have no idea if you really ask them those questions. So technology provides a way for these companies to run better business records and data. They can use that to then, of course, distribute better and grow the businesses. So while liquidity support is very important, I think at the same time, the other areas around market prioritization, digital skills support should be added or be a part of these interventions.
Agreed. And I think in the chat bar also somebody did mention that it is important because now use of technology has become part of the new normal more than ever before. We've had to turn to all these different applications or platforms to be able to continue the business. If we shift a little bit, Charlotte, earlier I listened to your intervention and you alluded to the framework of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Can you at least on this point tell us whether you believe that its effective application could strengthen the regional value chains, especially in the tourism sector, and also help to reduce the vulnerability to external shocks, also to advance, as we say, the digital transformation and build economic resilience against future crises? You have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Yes, I think basically the African Continental Free Trade Area is going to help us in terms of the market is going to be broad, and most of the issues is that we'll have a framework that is able to address the beyond the border issues, because currently we are having most of the consumer protection issues being dealt with in a fragmented way, and they are not uniform across the board. So this is the kind of framework that's going to bring about some form of harmonization or setting some form of minimum standards. It will strengthen the value chains because there will be predictability on what is expected, what are the rules, and how are the rules going to be enforced. And there's also going to be some level of transparency in how the consumer protection laws are going to be enforced. So the African Continental Free Trade Area is definitely an opportunity which we can use in terms of harmonization of the rules, bringing about predictability, and also bringing about uniformity in terms of the rules that can be followed. It's going to be easier for businesses to follow because the rules are going to be clear. They don't have to be guessing what are the level of protections that they have. Businesses are going to be able to know the kind of guarantees, legal guarantees that are there for them. Tourists are going to be able to know the kind of guarantees and legal securities that they have. So it's something that I'm very much obsessed about, pushing for harmonization at continental level, because I know it's going to definitely make the work both of the enforcement agencies and also of the tourists and the businesses much more easier.
Madam Fotabong, would you like to add on this, as NEPAD also, one of your core responsibilities is related to that?
Yes, thank you, Elsa. I think what the last speaker just said, I think certainly the Continental Free Trade Area is a welcome development that will, I think, will help to strengthen the regional value chains. But the conversation we had earlier about harmonization is of critical importance here. What the Continental Free Trade Area brings is the possibility of getting similar standards across the region, similar regulations across the region. So this will definitely open up issues of trade, issues of movement across the continent, and as Zulfi just said, there will be clarity in terms of the rules that are governing the different operations. So the Continental Free Trade Area, which is single rule book for trade and investment, I think will bring clarity for investors, both international but also domestic investors. I think was it 3 weeks ago now was when we had you organized the meeting of African tourism ministers. There was a lot of conversation about domestic tourism and regional tourism. And I think with the Continental Free Trade Area and what it intends to do in terms of harmonizing regulations, in terms of flows of movement of people and all of that, that is, one can begin to see this as a possibility, as a reality, that we will be able to grow regional tourist visits across the continent. Of course, there's a lot of work to be done. Hopefully, issues of advancing, we cannot assume that these things are there or are taken for granted. They have to be investments to make them real. So the digital transition needs to have the kind of investment that will create both the hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure to be able to put that in place and make this facilitate the regional value chains. Hopefully with this CFTA, the aviation industry will be more. I'm looking for the right word. We will have to have this open skies in the continent become a reality, or more of a reality, where you can easily travel to African countries. The issues of visas will be of standards of the hospitality. There is huge possibility. I think one should look at it from the possibilities that this opens, and that it gives us to be able to create and take advantage to grow the intra-African tourist industry.
Thank you. Indeed, there's still a lot to be done, as you say, and it goes beyond just having the will. You need the right infrastructure, you need the right framework. We are really coming towards the end of this program. I would want to ask one last question to everybody because it has been very in-depth, the discussion. Maybe a last question, because we've seen a lot of new ideas come out, especially during this crisis. We say whenever there is a crisis, there's also the opportunities that are coming up. And what are some, maybe if each one of you will do a quick round to say, what are some of the opportunities that you see now in this post-COVID business climate that we will see ourselves in, especially for our African entrepreneurs and how they can capitalize on them. Let me start with David. David, unmute yourself, please.
There's a number of opportunities that have come up as a result of this pandemic. One, you're seeing innovations around things like virtual tours, which is exciting. Of course, there's a question about how easy is it to commercialize things like virtual tours. You're seeing a number of interesting technology solutions. I can tell you that in this country, in Uganda alone, you're seeing so many proximity booking apps or app ideas coming up, which are very interesting. On a personal level, I think that the opportunity around growing the domestic and regional market, this is not technology based, this is purely reprioritizing the target market for many operators. I think for me is the biggest opportunity because it speaks into sustainability post-COVID, it speaks into growth, and it speaks into, many of these tech solutions now have a base with which they can be tested. They can actually start to see transactions before we try to scale them up to wherever it is we'd like to reach. So once again, thank you for the opportunity. And I think that this pandemic has shown us, or is starting to show us, that there's a viable tourism market on the continent. Thank you.
Eric, can you share your last point with us on this?
Yes. Look, I think that it would be unfair to present a scenario of just gloom as it relates to what COVID has done for the private sector in Africa, just because in the different surveys that we have done in different countries, there are actually a number of businesses that are reporting an uptick or a growth in their business. So of course, we are not discussing that a lot, but I think those businesses are there. And for a number of those businesses, it is an opportunity like none before to receive some capital at a very, very low rate, which can accelerate the growth. So I also believe that in the way we actually approach the response, we have to identify some of those businesses and support them, as David was saying, to kind of scale, because those businesses are going to be the key in helping Africa and the industry build back better. I would like to thank all the participants and also the UNWTO for the opportunity to share in this particular panel. And I look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Salifu?
Thank you, Elsia. I think the silver lining in COVID-19, if there should be one, is the fact that it has really opened our eyes up to possibilities. I mean, in the South African context, for instance, e-commerce is taking off big time. People are basically shopping online, which is obviously an innovation. There's been opportunities. It has opened up, COVID-19 has opened up opportunities for small business farmers, for instance, who are basically providing providing food to people, and it is all online. You have your suppliers that have all moved online, and you don't need to go to the grocery store anymore. And it has created market access for these producers, and it is also helping fight the spread of the pandemic. But we must also really take into consideration that COVID has happened at a time where Africa is making headways in creating this AFCFTA market, 1.2 billion consumers, 2.5 trillion GDP. I mean, we must use this opportunity of COVID to accelerate that process, as some of the panelists have already indicated. And from my perspective, one of the service sectors that should really play a great role in there is the tourism sector. We must consolidate our national tourism sectors, but basically develop to the fullest extent regional tourism, because at the end of the day, those two, the national tourism, domestic tourism and regional tourism, should be the backbone of our tourism industry in the continent. And there are lots of opportunities in there. I do not have to enumerate what you need to do to access those opportunities, but they're definitely there. And I'd like to stop here and thank UNWTO and NEPAD for inviting us to participate in this. And I'm so also happy to have met very good colleagues in the industry. We should make sure to keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Salifo, for your pertinent points as well. Charlotte, we move to you.
First of all, I'd like to extend my appreciation to UNWTO for inviting me to share experiences from Malawi and also from this side of the continent. Our consumer protection laws are very solid. Our enforcement is also robust in terms of consumer protection as well. And I would really take it that it would be a lost opportunity if we don't use this as a time for us to advocate for the need for these continental tools or for the global tools on how to address consumer protection issues, particularly with regards to tourism. So I think this would be a good time for us to strengthen our legal frameworks. I was actually looking at our COVID regulations here in Malawi, and we're seeing that they say nothing about consumer protection or even the protection of the tourists. They are very silent. We have regulations that are pretty much drafted for the public health aspects, but without looking at anything related to the rights of the tourist, who is very, very critical. So we've seen in South Africa and even in Malawi that some of these COVID regulations have been taken to court. There's aggressive litigation because we're finding that our legal frameworks are ignoring, the COVID regulations have ignored, and they're not passing the constitution test where there is the rights of protection of the rights of the consumer. So it would be good if we use this as an opportunity to continue to advocate for regional tools, continental tools, and also a global framework on how we can respond in the future. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share on what's happening in Malawi, across the COMESA region and in the SADC region. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I purposefully left Madame Futabong as the last one to intervene on this point, since you are partnering with us also on this webinar. But I just picked up from someone I know very well from Kenya, Jimmy, who's with the Sarova Hotels. The points he raises in the chat relates very much to what we've been talking about earlier. I think all the panelists mentioned this. We agree that domestic and intra-regional travel is something that we need to relook at. Look at the pricing, look at the different packages that are on offer also to the domestic consumers. Because in this time, definitely this is the market that we see, and we've seen even for Europe, that will be on the rebound first. So, Madame Esterine, can you share with us your last point on the opportunities that you see coming out of this pandemic?
Thank you so much, Elsa. I think the colleagues have all said it. What you yourself just mentioned, the opportunity for domestic and regional markets. But maybe before I say that, I would like to make the point that we all knew the importance of the tourism industry in our economies, at least those of us who have been participating in this industry. But I think what the COVID-19 has done has really also brought to the forefront the contribution of the tourism industry to our economy, both in terms of the revenue contribution to the GDP, as well as job creation in general, and an understanding of the value chain, the tourism value chain, and the need to have, when we talk about the industry, to look at it in that holistic manner. I think this is a very positive thing that has come out from the hotels and the rest of jobs all have been followed. So the impact of the industry in the economy, I think, has been highlighted. And so I think we will get more political mileage as a result of the realization by the general public of the importance of the sector to the economy. So I think that's a very important point. And we will therefore have opportunity to push some of the agendas that have been mentioned in this conversation, like, for instance, having regional funds or continental funds, or accessing global financial funds to support the tourism industry. This becomes more of a possibility because I think our member states will be more willing to prioritize the sector when it comes to budget allocation, but also to be able to go out there and take and look for resources, external resources to support the industry at the national level. In addition to that, I think the points, as I said, on the domestic and regional markets are critical. And as someone mentioned, with the CFTA, we have an opportunity to push this. And I think we should, because when everything is locked down, then we have the kind of impacts that we are facing right now. So growing domestic and regional tourism, I think, is something we need to invest in. Of course, innovations have been mentioned. We need to support these and promote more of innovativeness in the industry, not just for the private sector, but I think even more importantly, for the government departments that are involved in the tourism industry. And lastly, but not the least, I think the importance of partnerships is critical. We have seen that in a time of need, the governments have come in to bail out the private sector. And so because of the recognition that this is a critical sector for the economy and for our people. So partnerships between governments, the private sector, international organizations, and institutions like ours is, I think, going forward will be even much more important. So on that note, I really would like to thank WTO for the partnership that we have and for the opportunities that collectively we can bring to the industry and to ensure that we support the recovery of the industry by doing some of the structural changes that are needed. We have the assets. Our continent is blessed with all the assets that we need to drive the tourism industry. So the beach is there, the the natural resources are there, the people are there, our cultures is there. So we have the baseline for the industry. What we need is to build resilience, addressing what we have seen as a result of this pandemic, to make sure that we have a sustainable industry. So once again, I want to thank all the panelists. It's been a pleasure to be with you all in this panel and this very interesting discussion. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Madam Fotabong. I think you summed it up very well. You commented all on the touch points, but I think what has been two words that came out very strongly also beyond all our discussion was the trust and confidence. We really need to capture that in order to be able to restart the business. We need to build the trust, the confidence in order for the travelers to travel again to our shores. Just before we leave, I will ask my colleague Alicia also to maybe sum up in 2 words. But beyond that, I just want to share one very important initiative that we've just launched recently. I will ask again my colleague to put the link in the chat, which is related to the Brand Africa Challenge. We've seen in this discussion all the pertinent points that we've raised, all the good things that we have going on also in our continent, the different policy frameworks, the different infrastructure framework that is there. Of course, the topic today was specific on the rights of consumer protection, but I think there's also a bigger work for us to do in repositioning our continent in terms of all the positive things that are happening on the ground to put it forward. So we've embarked on a work with all the CEOs of the tourism boards from the continent, and we've just launched this Brand Africa Challenge, which we hope we will have a maximum participation from the different stakeholders that are out there in order to give us your views on how you perceive promoting our destinations. If we put the link, there you go. I think the closing date is on the 8th of August, so you still have time to partake in this challenge. Can you add something? Maybe you want to add something here before we get cut off. Alicia?
Thank you, Elsia. First of all, thank you, and thank you to all the panelists. It was very interesting, really, and I get a lot of ideas for the work that we're doing. I think it was also very interesting to see the polls from the audience and to see that there's really an awareness of these issues and the need and a requirement for us, UNWTO, to be working on it and support our member states. So to sum it up, I think there is an opportunity here to try and work on these issues and do something that is sensible, that is harmonized, and that brings back tourist confidence on the industry. So thank you very much, all. It was a pleasure, really, and a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all. Thank you to everybody who participated. We will share the presentation of Alicia. We will do a sum up also of this session here, and we've seen all the pertinent points also coming up in the chat bar, and we will keep you posted of any work that we do going forward. And definitely, I don't want to lose our panelists. I will definitely be in touch with you on another occasion, because we can see everybody has been very interested in the points that you shared with us. And again, thank you to Auda Nepad, who's always readily available to partner with us on such initiatives that we have. So once again, a very big thank you to all. I want to thank also the technical team behind making this happen. From the Academy, we have Tijana from my team as well, from the Africa department. Thank you to all for making this happen, and until the next session. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye. Bye. Bye.